Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of our Immigrant Success Canada's podcast. Today, Charlie and I have Joseph Sagaj as a special guest. Hi, Joseph. Hi, Charlie.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Before we dive right in, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. If I may, the land I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishnaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Metis people. I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the William Treaty, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And Charlie is in Sault Ste. Marie, which is covered in Robinson Huro Treaty territory, and the land on which is traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. Now, this podcast audience is people who want to come to Canada and they don't know what I just read. I didn't when I first heard it. What is it a land acknowledgement? According to Toronto-ca website, a territorial or land acknowledgement involves making a statement recognizing the traditional territory of the indigenous people who called the land home before the arrival of settlers, and in many cases still do call it home. Indigenous people have been acknowledging the land at the start of gatherings, ceremonies, and events for time immemorial. With the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, more non indigenous people are becoming aware of the importance. Providing a land acknowledgement at the beginning of an event or meeting gives time of reflection and demonstrates recognition of indigenous lands, treaties, and people. It involves thinking about what happened in the past and what changes can be made going forward in order to further the reconciliation process. Land acknowledgement mark a small and important step in the process of reconciliation and building a positive relationship with indigenous people. By making a land acknowledgement, you are taking part in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and indigenous presence, which dates back over 10,000 years. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this land acknowledgement. And once you'll come to Canada, you'll be seeing and hearing these acknowledgements in all the major events and some ceremonies that happen through this territory. Joseph, it's an honor and a privilege to have you as a guest to our podcast. Our audience is made of people who want to come to Canada and they want to learn more about the history, the culture, the traditions, and the people from Canada. But before we dive right in, would you care to make an introduction? Would you like to introduce yourself to our audience? It's better than any other introduction I could make about you.
Well, I think you did a fantastic job there. Thank you for the acknowledgement, and your pronunciation is pretty close, except for the Haudenosaunee. It's pronounced Haudenosaunee. So they're the Iroquois nation, as they call them, and they generally live around Brantford, Six Nations, all the way stretched to New York City. And there's different nations, Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee. And the Ojibwe too are very vast in Ontario, as well as the Wendat people, and also the Cree Nation and the mixture of Metis and Inuit. So thank you for doing that. And Charlie, hi, hello, good to see you. And I understand you're up in Sault Ste. Marie, land of the Anishnaabe people. I'm originally come from Neskantaga, which is probably another 500 kilometers north from Sault Ste. Marie,
Wow.
and probably about 1,000 miles directly north of from the center of the universe,
Mm.
Barrie, Ontario.
Ontario is huge, right?
Ontario is huge, yes. Some times people get the misconception that Ontario or even Canada is a small country.
Because of population,
Yeah,
right?
Ontario is bigger than Germany. So, you can imagine like 10 provinces. It's quite a big country. Takes about 5 days to go all across Canada to Vancouver. And if you wanted to go to the East Coast, it's probably another day and a half or so. So it's quite a big, huge country. So where I come from is a little small dot in the center of Ontario, and it's called Neskantaga. And the population there is 300 people.
Oh, wow. Just the
Yeah,
300. That's
300
it.
people. Yeah. So we know everybody's story and we can gossip all day long about, you know, Joe's secrets and Mary's story and so on. So it's a pretty interesting little community. And, but today I live in the big city of Toronto of 4.5 million people. So you can imagine the cultural shock that I had to delve into as a younger person back 30, 40 years ago.
Would you care to actually detail your entire journey? And also, I would like our audience to know right now that Joseph is a artist, a visual artist, a painter, um, and I'll let him tell his story in more details because I'm part of the reason why we're doing this podcast is for me to actually get to sit and talk with people such as Joseph. I
Well,
feel
thank you for
privileged.
the opportunity. That's awesome. I like your question, and like I said, where I come from is a very small community, and coming to the city so big as Toronto, it's quite overwhelming.
Sure.
And I'm sure, like, if I were to go to another country like India or Korea or Australia or New Zealand or any other place, I would probably be feel overwhelmed of not knowing what's behind the curtain, right? So, and I would imagine most of the people that want to migrate to Canada or even visit, I think would have probably a lot of questions. And I hope I can maybe share some that could answer some of those questions. Now, first off, you mentioned that I am an artist, and I'm not struggling as much as I used to. But when I did start off, when I first came here to Toronto, it would have probably been a lot easier if I just got a regular job, like washing dishes in a restaurant. Not that, you know, that's any lower than what I'm doing now, but washing dishes is pretty common, and or waitressing, or being a cab driver, and I think that would have been maybe an easier profession to pay my bills and to also have a regular 9 to 5 job. As an artist, it's a different story, a different ball game, and that's something that I had to deal with right from the beginning, even before I left my reserve, which is of 300 people.
Excellent. And when did that happen? You said 30 something years ago.
Yeah, back in in the last century, literally 1900s, right? It's the last century. We're not talking about when dinosaurs were running around, but 1970, I think I started to blossom as a kid, and I've always wanted to be an artist. I was influenced by other artists and other talented people around me. And the way we, I think, identified talent as a pool was not restricted to just being an artist, like a visual artist. We kind of broadened that with storytelling, with crafts, and that extended to the skill that kind of expanded to making snowshoes or making sleds or even doing beadworking or storytelling. So that was vast. So there was no category of, hey, you're an artist, you can do drawing, you can do beadwork, you're a craftsperson. There was no categorization in that nature. Everybody did something. We were all talented in some way, and we could share our skills to another in to serve the community in a broader sense. So that's kind of how I grew up under that umbrella. And I never really thought myself different as a visual artist or a storyteller. So that's kind of what I appreciate about my upbringing. And I grew up listening to storytellers like elders, and elders would tell stories of the story that I remember was about this child that was left out in the woods by himself. And the idea was that he was supposed to be maturing through adventure. So I remember that story. And as a kid, I imagined myself being that little kid being left to his own devices and entering into this adventurous, much like Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter entering into the world of adventure. It was a world of magic. It was a world of unexpected turn of events, meeting all kinds of sorcerers and all kinds of witchcraft and so on, right? And in our stories, there's stories of that nature, and we meet all kinds of characters. Like every culture has um, the trickster, so everybody can relate to the trickster, and we have our stories of the trickster in our legends. So that's the kind of narrative that I was influenced with as a child. So that really influenced the way I thought of the world with imagination, right? It's like Alice in Wonderland. You enter into this rabbit hole, and the further you go, the more imaginative it becomes, right? And I was not knowing anything about Harry Potter or Alice in Wonderland. I was already influenced to think in those terms. So my imagination and my mind was already influenced in that way of thinking. So as a kid, we always kind of tried to um, live live out these characters. Sometimes I would play the trickster. Sometimes I would play another character or an animal that transformed or a shaman. We always had this influence to think in those terms and play those parts. And I always thought it was, a good influence to grow into.
Thank you so much for that answer, and the way you gave. I was waiting exactly like a story, and I relate to that. Thank you so much. Now I know that Charlie has a couple of questions as well, but you mentioned something about struggles. I yet found an artist that hadn't struggled at the beginning, and to an extent still struggles, sometimes creatively, sometimes emotionally. That's many times represented in his potentially in your case drawings, in music, the music they create, and the art that their craft is in. uh, where are you right now in that as an artist?
Well, in my early beginnings, I struggled as much as the other kids did. 9, 10 years old. We grew up in an environment that had very vast amount of difficulties with alcoholism, residential schools, and incarceration, gangs, and gas sniffing, and so on. So I grew up in that kind of environment, a very interrupted and disturbed culture, right? And it wasn't all our fault. We were looking to continue to survive. And because of the oppression and because of the strong influence and impact in our cultures and the way it disturbed us, we had to adapt in a way that we had to survive. Some of us ended up in residential schools. Some of us ended up in institutions. Some of us ended up in residential schools, and so on. So that had a tremendous impact in the way we were brought up. For me, as an individual person, growing into teenagehood, I struggled with difficulties in alcoholism and also gas sniffing and so on. So some of the kids that I grew up with when they were 12, 13 years old, they're already committing suicide, and that's still ongoing today. And there were some of them ended up in jails, and I was also confronted with all kinds of difficult tasks or challenges in the justice system. So the judge that I used to face used to buy my art on a regular basis. He was a circuit judge, and because it was far north, they would fly in and deal with us. I'd have like a list of charges, and then he would put me on probation. So this one time, to get more personal into my tragic situation, I was at a point through my addiction and through my alcoholism where I was contemplating suicide. And when I was doing that at that point, I was ready to go across the kitchen table, pull out the drawer, and get a weapon and do myself in. And that's how some of these kids that I grew up with ended up doing to themselves. Some of them hung themselves, some of them stabbed themselves, some of them ended up in jail, some of them eventually, as they got old, ended up in prison. And I thought, you know, there was no hope for me. So that's what I wanted to do. And my best friend kicked me out of my place. And I looked out the window, drew out the curtains, and it's 60 below where I come from, right, in terms of winter. And I didn't see nowhere where I could go anymore. My stepfather didn't want me. My family didn't want me. My house had burnt down where I lived, you know, and I was staying at a friend's. I didn't have no clothes and I didn't have any possessions. So where am I to go, right? And my best friend said, I want you out of here. I don't want you to eat anymore out of my cupboards. Just leave. So that's where I was left with. No hope, nothing beyond what I could imagine beyond that. And I wanted to do myself in. Then I walked across the kitchen table and I heard this knock, and it was the constable. And the constable said, the judge wants to see you at the airport. I got ready, took me to the airport, got inside the plane, and it was a different judge. He said, Judge Mitchell, put you on probation. He sent me here to deal with you. You broke your probation. Do you want to deal with it here and now inside the plane? And I said, sure. What have I got to lose? Was what I was thinking. And he says, okay, he read the charges. How do you plead? My lawyer said, just plead guilty. I said, guilty. 30 days. And that's how I got out of that situation. I don't know how to explain it other than the fact that it must have been divine intervention. How would the judge know my circumstances at that point, that pivotal point in my life where I saw no hope? And he sent a judge to deal with me. And he sentenced me to 30 days, which actually saved my life. I called that judge later on after. I said, thank you for saving my life. He said, on what? He says, well, remember that time you sent me to that airport? He says, yeah. He says, you saved my life by doing that. I just wanted to thank you. He says, you know what? Nobody ever calls me to thank me for sending them to jail. And I said, well, that's what happened to me, you know. And what are you doing now? I said, well, I'm doing my art. I went to Toronto. I graduated in the arts, and that's what I'm doing now. So there's my personal struggle and my story, spiritual story of my struggle, the pivotal point, the turning point, and what I'm doing now.
Thank you so much for sharing this story with us and for sharing all the other information, because unfortunately that is a reality that Canada faces, and there's no better person who could have said that story than you. Thank you
you.
so much. I know Charlie has a couple of questions as well.
First of all, I really appreciate your own story which is very emotional. And so, as you might know, Emmanuel and I immigrated from different countries to Canada. And my original question was, so you told your story, and there are still, because I live in Sault Ste. Marie, I know still a lot of indigenous people are still struggling with a lot of things, as you mentioned, drugs, alcohol, and so I have experienced directly and indirectly because I have lived here for the last almost 17 years. So I met personally many indigenous people, really good people, and also somewhat strange. And so I also have my own experience. So my original question to you was that, so you talked about your turning point, but still, what made you to come to Toronto and living a different life than you used to live? So what was the real motivation? One, when you look back on, what was it?
That's an amazing question. Thank you. And probably you reworded your question, like you said. You had an original question and you kind of modified it. But that is more of a personal question. And I do have a little story that kind of relates to the many paths that happen in life. And my story changed from where I came from to where I was in jail. Now, there was a guy there in jail. I won't mention his name, but he was getting ready to go to prison, maximum prison. And he was preparing himself because he was in there for murder. And I was really terrified of this guy. And I thought, holy mackerel, he looked like Charles Manson, like just pacing back and forth. He was getting all toned up, muscular, and all that. I was watching him, like the cell is only like about 20 feet long, right? By 8 feet. That's how much space he had. And there's a bench across the other room. And he's just going back and forth. He had no shirt on. He was all muscular. And he did this backflip. And I thought, oh, he scared me even more. And I thought, that's really scary that he's going to prison, And I thought of my life, that could be where I could end up too if I keep doing what I'm doing. The drinking, the gangs, everything that I've done up to that point, I could end up in prison just like this guy. So he was a powerful example to me. And that's not where that story ends with this guy, but what happened was I chose a different spiritual path. And to break my anonymity, I went to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, for my drinking problem. And that really, really, really changed my life. And hold that thought. Where I went from there, when I finished my jail term, was I went to a halfway house. I took upgrading to learn how to speak proper English. I took life skills. And then I applied to the Ontario College of Art here in Toronto. This is all happening in Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is a smaller city like Sault Ste. Marie. And so I'm in Thunder Bay. I'm thinking maybe if I go to Ontario College of Art in Toronto, maybe that could work out for me as an artist. So I got accepted. I got a letter. I got accepted on a condition that I take grade 13 English. Grade 13 English, what's that? You know what that is? Shakespearean, grade 13 English. To be or not to be. Can you imagine, like, a 20-year-old coming from a small reserve with 300 people
Mm,
learning grade 13 English.
mm,
It would be like coming from another country, small country, let's say,
mm,
and learning how to speak English. That's just as difficult, right?
mm. Okay.
That's how difficult it was for me to learn grade 13 English, but that was a condition. But I was so determined to change my life that I took summer school after I completed life skills and attained level 3, which is
Mm,
equivalent to grade 8. I
mm,
took grade 13 English in summer school. And while everybody else was playing baseball and enjoying the summer, I was in the basement studying, because I really wanted to pass. And I got
mm,
accepted. Everything was okay. I thought, whoa. I moved to Toronto,
mm.
stayed in the halfway house still, and I went to Ontario College of Art, completed that in 4 years. And then, like I said, I phoned that judge. I thanked him. I kept on going to AA and I changed my life. And I went to Sweats. And what happened was, Sweat Lodge is like equivalent to a Shinto ceremony in Japan, let's say. Maybe not as equivalent, but it's going into the river in India, something spiritual, right? That could really alter and change your life. Sweat Lodge is something like that. You go into this dark space where you go meet with your creator or your higher power or whatever you want to call your creator, your own personal choice. But that's where we call our creator, and we crawl into the space, and then we have an interaction with our creator. Well, that's what I did. But here's the story of that guy that was going off to prison. I'm talking about this guy when I'm coming out of this lodge, right? The sweat lodge. I'm saying, I remember this guy, blah, 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 blah. And one of the guys goes, "Hey, I know that guy you're talking about." I said, "Yeah." So I described him. He says, "Yeah, that's him." I said, "Whatever happened to him?" Oh, he said, he got 10 years for manslaughter. He went to Stony Mountain Penitentiary in Manitoba. I thought, whoa, Stony Mountain. That's a pretty difficult, harsh place.
Mm.
And then when he came out, story he continues, he goes, when he came out, he became a minister. Really?
What a change, man.
Charles Manson became a minister? That's what
Not
I'm
not
thinking.
not Minister of Natural Resources of Ontario government,
No,
right?
minister for a church.
Church.
How did I do it? He said, that's hard to believe. I said, yeah. I thought, what an amazing story, which showed me like there's many paths in life. Like, I don't know what your story is, Charlie and Emmanuel, but we all have a story. We all carry a story that inspires people, right? And the listeners too have stories, right?
Oh, by the way, another important question is, how did you support yourself financially? You didn't have any job and then studying, and then where did you get all your money to do that?
Well, the first thing I did was rob a bank.
Yeah, I thought about it.
No, I'm just kidding. No, I was,
I was kidding.
yeah, Bernie Madoff, like in New York City. No, I'm just kidding. You know the story of Bernie Madoff. Not to
I know.
discredit him or anything like that, but that's an amazing story, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, no, I just kind of struggle like every other artist. I there's a system here in Toronto and probably in other countries, but in Canada, if you can't make it, you can apply to social assistance, which is a little more lenient than it used to be. So I had to go on that a couple of times or so, and they're very, very supportive. If you can't pay your rent, you can apply to social assistance. I'm not ashamed to mention that, but I've had to do that a few times because I struggled very, very hard. And sometimes, I have to contemplate, should I buy food or should I buy a loaf of bread or should I buy paint? Sometimes I choose to buy paint, you know.
Yeah.
I want to stay a little blue to complete the painting, that kind of decision making. but I struggled, so I know what struggling is all about. But in Toronto, there's also many places where you can go to food banks, which I've also lined up at. There's also places where you can go and eat, like the Scott Mission, St. Francis Tables. There's a lot of other places where you can go to go eat. And you can meet a lot of interesting people there. And I have, a lot of interesting people. I'm sure you've, met a lot of interesting people in life. I got 101 stories of different nationalities with stories. I've met people from Germany, that were in World War One, World War Two. I've met people from Korea, I've met people from Australia, with all kinds of stories, and
Okay,
it's a very interesting life.
that's
I'm,
great. Yeah.
I'm so happy that Joseph mentioned that, because I wanted to say that many newcomers go through some of these struggles, and Canada is probably one of the places where you can actually survive in certain circumstances that other places where I come from, for example, there's no such thing. There are, of course, programs such as social assistance, but they don't mean much, to be honest. And many newcomers go through this process, and it's okay. And I'm happy that you mentioned it, because it never occurred to me to mention it.
Okay, so that's great. So, wow, our conversation goes really smoothly, and we spent a lot of time. So, I'd like to talk about a little bit just now and then future, and then the relationship between indigenous people and immigrants. And so, I'd like to hear from you, what kind of view do you have about immigrants, or from yourself, or your friends, or your group? What, if there is any perspective, right? And so, because in Canada we have three groups of people, right? Indigenous, non-indigenous, immigrants, right? So we get together and try to live together, and because Canada could be one of the best countries in the world because of diversity, or it could be disaster because of diversity. We can kill each other and then hate each other all the time, right? So what does really reconciliation and those things means, right? So for me, as I told you, I have lived in Sault Ste. Marie 17 years, so I know much better than Emanuel about what the relationship with the indigenous people, personally and business-wise. And from my own story, if I try to relate to it, it might be like this. I don't know how much you know about history of Korea. So Korea was colonized by Japan, and Korea was colony of Japan for 35 years, from 1910 to 1945. So as I was growing up, I really hate the Japanese people, right? Because they invaded Korea and then made the Korean people as their servants or slaves, right? Basically. So while I was growing up, the reason I studied was to compete against Japanese and to beat Japanese. That's why you have to study hard, right? That's the only way you really overcome Japan and Japanese people, right? But those relations now, it was 1945, it ended, and then now almost 70 or 80 years have passed, right? So what kind of feelings and emotions, and then going forward between Japanese and Korean, that kind of relationships, right? So I'll give you just some context about that. But so now another thing is, now the young people who don't know the history, and then people who didn't actually experience it, they don't know about it and how much they think about, right? For example, my daughter went to Japan to study economics as exchange student. So she's now in Japan in 4 months, right? And then traveling Japan and then seeing Japan. So her view about Japanese and my view about Japanese is different, right? So, but anyway, this is not my story. So I'd like to hear your story. So in the context of immigrants and indigenous people, if you can give some thoughts or perspective, and then it can go now from now to next generation and that in the future. If you think this could be better, even though it is very difficult and then it takes time and then we don't know how much we can do about that, right? But still, do you believe there's a hope or no? It will not really be reconciliation or like that. So I think, yeah, I'd like to hear your honest opinion and then going forward, if you have any perspective.
Well, that's an amazing story that you shared there. You started off by talking about if I know any history of Korea. Like other countries, I'm always fond of learning. I'm open-minded, and I think of myself as teachable. So I've always grew up in that kind of mentality, and I hung around with different nationalities when I was going to the Ontario College of Art here in Toronto. And interestingly, I used to hang out with this Korean fellow, and I remember we took a watercolor course, and it was a I don't want to say Japanese, but I think he was Chinese. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think I don't know what nationality he was, but we took this watercolor course, and in the end, the instructor said, "There's only two," and I don't think it was appropriate that he did this, but he said, "There's only two artists here that were so close to 100% in the watercolor course." And watercolor is very hard medium to handle, right? And he said, one of them is Kim and the other one is Joseph. Not like, oh, me? Who, me? you know, 99%. Now that, whoa, watercolor is so difficult to, to even attempt at, right? A lot of artists find that intimidating. But because of my determination, I never thought like these challenges and these are, welcome task for me to overcome, right? Or even at least try. So I've never had any difficulty overcoming any barriers that I have socially, whether it's racial, cultural, or color. Um, Sometimes, sure, I'm a human being, but I never grew up in that kind of environment. As a matter of fact, when I was on the reserve, I don't think I learned anything about racial difference until I moved to Thunder Bay. You know, that's when I learned something about racism. And then when I came to Toronto, I even learned more about racism. And a lot of times I think it's not so much the color of your skin, but it's cultural. That's even another layer, right? And then there's religion. And then there's, social. And then there's economics, there's different layers of racism, right? And you can go down this rabbit hole as far as you want. But for me, it's not healthy to go that route. Like I said, I've always been open minded and welcoming to all colors. And I like studying a little bit about India, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, or Canadian, or Alaska, or the Arctic, or Norway, or even Scotland, or even Korea. And I know Korea has had their difficult times as well as Vietnam and other countries, Afghanistan and Iran and Pakistan and so on. So I know Korea is like a piece of pie, right? There's the Russian bear, there's China, and you mentioned Japan. There's also India, And India has borders with their Himalayas, and then there's just so much like divisions around the world, right? But in the end, like we're all human beings
Mm.
under one human race, no matter what color we are, right?
So do you believe in imagine all the people living in peace by John
Yeah,
Lennon?
you know what? There's a story to that, Imagine John Lennon, the way he wrote that song, where he got his influence from is a conversation he had with a Cree woman
Oh
from
yeah.
Saskatchewan.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Mm.
And the Cree woman apparently said, well, imagine if we could all live together, you know?
Okay.
And
Mm.
that, you get your influences. John Lennon had influences even from his son. His son came home one day and he asked him, well, what did you do today in school? And he said, well, we drew, and I drew this little girl. I call it Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, right?
Mm.
And John Lennon wrote the song about Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. But there's a story, like I said, to
Mm.
imagine, like just imagine those words. Hey, if we could live, we're all
Mm.
dreamers, but he's not the only one. I'm a dreamer. You're probably a dreamer. You know, we're all dreamers in one way or another.
Yeah.
And I think ideally, yes, I
Mm.
wish we could all live together. Like Rodney King said, can't we just get along? Right? Can't we just all get along? What
So
a
you see,
profound statement.
so it seems that you are positive and then kind of some that we can live together very well by understanding each other, right? Kind of more positive way. And then, so do you think it's happening now? And going forward, we can be optimistic?
With a note that Canada just passed 40 million people just a couple of weeks ago, so not long, which is very small number considering the territory that Canada has.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Like globally, India, I think, surpassed their 1 billion mark. Probably China has too. Um, Now, I think it's inevitable that we're just going to keep multiplying and multiplying and multiplying to imagine 10 billion people. Imagine 20 billion people. Whoa, that's a big, big number, but it's not impossible that we are going to end up with 20 billion people in the world in the next 10 years. You know?
unless unless there is no nuclear war, right? What if there were nuclear war and then destroy and then it could be just 1 million or 2 million, okay?
Well, today, that's funny you should say that because most countries back 20 years ago, the United States and the Soviet Union were probably the only ones capable of nuclear arsenal. Now, how many countries have them, right? There's
So many,
Iran,
including
yeah,
North
North
Korea.
Korea, yeah. So your neighbors are, you know, but they're doing it for a reason, right? We call them radicals, right? But in their country, they call them freedom fighters, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure, like, I don't know, I don't want to get too political, but think about this. When the Bay of Pigs in Cuba was happening, the reason why the United States went against that was because the Russians were planting their nuclear arsenal right next door, right? And today, the United States has the potential to do this right next door to Russia, which is in what's that country?
Ukraine?
Ukraine, right? Sorry, I'm thinking of so many countries, but Ukraine, Georgia, had that possibility, and Hitler was going around the world to do it in many countries like Poland, and he was just keeping moving on to Soviet Union, which they created like a big, huge uh, arsenal against him, that eventually defeated him. So, we could get into that. We could get into that political route and military conversation, but I don't think it's about that. It's about what does the immigrant, so-called immigrant, expect when they come to Canada. I can only speak about Canada. I can only speak for myself in my views. So coming back to ourselves and to this conversation, um, I think we could have a 3-hour conversation around that. So anyway, I'll cut right here and come back to you, Emmanuel and Charlie.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all my questions. I think that was really
I'll
interesting conversation.
I'll take it from here. And before we say our goodbyes, I'd like to get this promise from you, Joseph, that you just told us that you had at least 101 stories from a single place. So perhaps you'll find time to come and visit us again as a guest and share one of those 101 stories from just one time. They're probably 1,000 or 1 million. So if you want to come again and talk to our listeners, please.
And just lastly, I noticed that you are a very good storyteller. Yes, because when you talk, I listen to you and I was engaging in your stories. So I think so that's a great talent you have. So I think definitely that shows in your art and so. But thank you for having conversation with us today. I enjoyed it.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and I really enjoyed it. And like I said, yeah, we all have stories, and one day I'll listen to yours. And if you ever come to Toronto, and don't hesitate to Google me this weekend. I'm this coming weekend, July 7th to 9th. I'm at the City Hall, the TOAF. If you Google TOAF, Toronto Outdoor Art Fair, I'm one of the 400 artists, and there's different nationalities there. And amazing artists, amazing talent, and you'd be surprised just how incredible these artists bring to this event. And my booth will be number 40. So Emmanuel, Charlie, pop in if you can, and if there's visitors from other countries and the listeners, don't hesitate to come and say hi, and maybe you can tell me your story.
I just dropped the link here, so it's toif.ca, and it's happening July 2023 from July
7 to 9.
7 to 9. We're going to publish this episode as soon as possible. And actually, my next question is, where can people find you? We're going to drop links in the description and in the post that we're going to be putting on our website. But where's the best place for people to find you, to connect with you, to see your art and buy it if they want to?
Well, the corner of Queen and Sherbourne, I'll be standing out there with a Tim Horton cup. That'll be after July 7 and 9 if I don't sell anything here. But no, one of the things that I'm glad you said that, because I'm going through some changes, and change meaning that, I'm going to develop a new website, and also changing my last name to Sagaj, which is the original spelling. But if you Google the Toronto sign, which I designed, the Toronto sign at Nathan Phillips Square, the Toronto sign where millions of people from all around the world go to Nathan Phillips Square at City Hall to take selfies and take pictures.
Yeah,
send this picture all over the world, really. The Toronto sign is about 20 feet long, TORONTO, with the medicine wheel and the maple leaf at each end, right?
Yeah.
So I designed the wraparound of that, of all those letters. And that's my artwork there. And it's a very advantageous for me because it's going to be right at the TOAF event. So this Toronto sign is kind of like my art piece in the Toronto sign.
Wow.
And also my booth is going to be booth number 40. My artwork is going to be there with some of the artwork I used. So I think it's really going to really make some changes to my career. It already has, because I've got offers for murals and other events, logo designs, and speaking engagements, etc., right? So as a struggling artist, I know how difficult it was. I know how difficult it is in any profession, to make it in life and make a comfortable living, right? So this is what's happening to me, and I'm grateful for, the listeners and also the people that have bought my artwork and also commissioned me to do amazing stuff in the past because of the liberty in extracting from the stories that I do have and carry from our elders. And that's the backing I have is my elders and the resource people that I have in my community to share these stories to the world. And I'm grateful for that. I didn't do it single-handedly, and I certainly acknowledge the people that have influenced me, that have participated in my career. So I would be glad, like, to meet some of these people in my booth at the Toronto Outdoor Art Fair this coming weekend.
Many of the people who are following us have not yet come to Canada. So I believe your current Facebook page is the best place if they want to say hello and reach out to and get to learn more from you.
Yes,
Is that
absolutely.
correct?
Yes.
And
I'm on Facebook currently right now.
I am going to put the link on the screen right now for those who are watching, and all the links and the images that you mentioned from the Toronto sign, from Nathan Phillips Square, and your art, and links to your Facebook and Instagram will be featured on our website, which is isc-go.com. I usually say this in the introduction of our episodes, but I've skipped today. But I'm going to mention here. Charlie and I have a program called Immigrant Success Canada, and it's a coaching program designed to help people who come to Canada to be happy and successful for at least 20 years and moving forward. Part of our part of the journey is education as well. And I see this podcast of ours has a great educational channel where people can meet uh, people, artists, and great people, storytellers such as yourself. And if they come back, that means that they actually like me and Charlie. And get to learn more about what actually Canada is, because it's hard to define what Canada is, and to an extent, in my opinion, it's not supposed to be easy. But long story short, on our website you will find more information. You'll find links to this episode, the YouTube link, the audio, the transcript, and also how you can contact Joseph. And the most important thing, watch his art, because I was amazed by the art at first before anything else. The fact that I had the opportunity to have you as a guest, it's the cherry on top, and I feel very humbled and quite nervous, hence some of the mispronunciations that I had at the beginning. That being said, Joseph, any last words to our listeners?
Well, I'm glad that I had this platform and an opportunity and a privilege to share with you my background, my story as Indigenous person. And I know we live in a great country, one of the greatest countries in the world, full of great people like yourselves. And don't be intimidated by anything that you think negatively of, because meet people like us, like Charlie, I only met him a couple of times, but I really like this dude. And so is Emmanuel. I met him in person many times, and wonderful guy and very interesting fella. And I think your listeners would should not hesitate to at least visit this country, if not move here, because it's one of the greatest places you can come to all across Canada, whether it's Edmonton, Vancouver, Winnipeg, St. John's, Newfoundland, or I could name 101 places that you could move to. And there's a lot of great people in this
Great
country. And,
Canada.
absolutely. And Canada has a lot of Indigenous people too that you can visit, and meet. And Toronto is one of the places that's so diverse, you know. People from all over the world come to this country. And whenever I go downtown to City Hall to go see my sign, I see tons of people taking pictures. Every 20 seconds there's someone taking a picture, right? And I'm so happy for that because this is what we share to the world, as First Nations people. And I'm glad I got to meet some of them as they were taking pictures. They're asking, where can I meet an indigenous person? Well, I'm one of them. As a matter of fact, I designed one of them. You did? You did that sign? And I said, yeah, I'm humbled too, and I'm glad I had this opportunity to share and, to be able to have this conversation. I hope we meet again. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you
Great.
so much. Thank you so much. Nothing to add anymore. Thank you for watching.